2 years ago, we got the infamous interview from Genshin Impact developers that made us think that we were never going to get more endgame content, or more difficult endgame content. And even now, after all of this time, you still hear the meme about creating anxiety and wanting to avoid creating anxiety in players by making anything in this game remotely difficult. Yet here we are with Imaginarium Theater, another endgame mode. Now, there is the argument to be made that this may not be true endgame because in a lot of ways, it is easier than the Spiral Abyss. The enemies are generally a lot weaker due to the other restrictions in this mode. However, it is those restrictions that can actually make the Imaginarium Theater a lot more difficult than the Spiral Abyss if your roster can't accommodate them. And while they may have borrowed the support system from Honkai Star Rail, you can only have one in a mode where you can have up to like 12 units, and that is just not very impactful. Yeah, sure, that one unit may be able to do a fair bit of work, but it is certainly not going to carry you through the entire experience. If you're still somehow unfamiliar with the restrictions that this mode imposes on you, here is the rundown. If you're going to do it on the hardest difficulty, which you need to do for the maximum points, you're going to need to select up to 18 characters at a minimum of level 70. You can only invite one supporting character. On top of that, you can only bring 3 specific elements, so the restrictions are quite heavy. And quite possibly one of the most horrible restrictions this mode imposes on you is that you always have to bring 4 people into combat. So even if you have one really strong character that you are absolutely sure could solo an entire level, well, it doesn't matter because it's going to force you to bring some units even if they are entirely not necessary. And sometimes that may even mean a unit that you really wish you could save for later, but you just don't have the means to not bring them right now. I'm actually a-okay with all the other restrictions that this mode imposes on you, but that one specific one is a really feels bad moment. What is the point of having really strong characters if you can't even just take advantage of that and bring one by themselves in order to make your later stages better? So let's take a break from that thought process for a moment, and I want to talk about this game mode as a whole. I'm going to come right out and say that I love this game mode, but my account is in such a position that it was basically designed to handle a game mode like this, where someone who is free to play is probably going to struggle quite a lot, especially on weeks where maybe they just don't like specific elements and they never really rolled for any characters of that element. Because previously, you know, if a okay, they won't struggle as much as I am struggling to speak right now. Previously, there were no real strict requirements in this game for you to have one specific element. Let's say a floor of the Spiral Abyss had a ton of pyro shields. Okay, maybe you don't have a lot of Hydro units for some reason, even though that would be crazy. You can still use Electro or Geo, which pretty much works okay against everything, to still function. You are going to be fine. But in this game mode, if you, for whatever reason, ignore an entire element and that just happens to show up in the rotation for this, you're in for a bad time. Not to mention, there are elements like Geo and Animo that already do not have an insane amount of characters, and even in those small rosters, there are some pretty rough characters. Not many people invest into their Noels, and while Noel may be a great unit at C6, if you don't have C6, that's basically a dud. Then you have Ningguang. Sorry to the Ningguang mains, but she is rather rough to play. Then what are you gonna do? Bring out Geo main character? The enemies in this game mode are a lot easier than the Spiral Abyss, but they're not that much weaker. So with all of these restrictions, when you go back to that interview and they say that they don't want to make more endgame modes and like things like the Spiral Abyss may make players anxious, what the f is this game mode? You think some enemies with 1,000,000 HP are going to give people anxiety, but the idea of owning half the roster to be viable in this game mode isn't? I don't even have words for that thought process. I get it. It's a gacha game. Rolling for characters is their bread and butter, and it is also why most people play this game. But like, if one thing is going to give them anxiety, it's the idea that they need to spend so much money to get every new character to actually keep up with this game mode. Not only that, but there is a vast majority of the players of this game, like I would venture to say 90%, who live and die for one single character. And I think any cycle of this where that one character isn't going to be usable is going to be a rather sour experience for them, especially if they always use them, no matter what. The anxiety excuse always sounded flimsy at best. I mean, how many people are out there who are really having anxiety about not being able to do the Spiral Abyss? Maybe some, but that's just that you need to have endgame there. Like, what is the point of having a gacha game where you can wish for constellations and get all this extra power for characters if there's nothing to even remotely take advantage of it? Now, nobody wants to live in a world where we need constellations on characters. They should just be for fun and for power and for being excessive. And not every person wanted more difficult content. Some people just wanted more endgame. Some people like myself would just been okay with better endgame. And let me just say this, I love the Imaginarium theater. A lot of these complaints that I'm talking about are complaints that the greater community will have but aren't affecting me. But that sure as hell doesn't mean they're not important. Most players are not filthy whales like me. They are low spending guppies, or they're just entirely free to play, and they just don't have these insane rosters unless they've been playing for a long time. And that's part of this. I don't think any player who's been playing as long as me, free to play or otherwise, should really be struggling heavily with this game mode. But for the new player experience, which is always important in every game, this is bad. Let's just forget about the gacha and wishing cost and just how big of a roster you need to have, but you also need to gear that roster. That means you need an appropriate artifact set and weapon for up to 18 characters. Now, you don't need 18 characters for this. Through the game mode, you can get little buffs and instances where you can actually bring back characters that have used up all their uses, and that is really good. I also think the game mode is fun enough that replaying it to get a better outcome wouldn't be that unenjoyable of an experience, not to mention the reset time is generous enough where it's not like that's going to be something you're doing every single week, which no matter how fun it would be, would eventually become a very tedious task. For me personally, the worst thing about this game mode, and the one thing I really hate about it, is it just really exacerbates, not the kind of word you should be using when you've been messing up as much as I have been tonight, which I've edited out most of the mistakes I'm making. They're plentiful. They're plentiful on a good day. In any case, what I was talking about is this makes a particular problem so much worse than it used to be, and that is the poor excuse for an artifact loadout system. Now, I've been critical of the system, and I've also given it a little bit of credit where credit is due. It has its moments, not very many moments, but it can get the job done sometimes in very specific scenarios. But for something like this, where you are trying to gear some characters that you never use, which you do so by taking from characters you actually use but just don't fit the elemental requirement, well, it just reminds me how much I dislike this system and how unhappy I am with it. Like, we need something better than this, especially with such an insane roster of characters and now a game mode that actually encourages you to build so many characters. Like, you can't expect me to have like what is it, like 70 something characters built at all times? No, some characters are going to be sharing, and we need a better loadout system to actually swap them around. Something I find a little bit funny and almost a little bit aggravating is Star Rail just got another game mode called the Divergent Universe, and in that game mode, you have access to every character in the game, whether you own them or not. And even if you own a character, it may increase their level and even change their build if the game deems your build not adequate enough. And that game mode doesn't even need that. And yet we have this game mode in Genshin that definitely could have used that feature. I get that would kind of defeat the purpose of this being an endgame mode if in most cases it's not even using your own characters unless they are built enough. But at the same time, you could have just introduced this feature and only let you use so many like boosted characters, and that way it would almost function as an extended trial. You could also use some characters that you don't own, but with some characters that you actually own and see maybe if you like the way they feel in your account. It would have been kind of cool. Now, me personally, I don't think I would want that because I don't like what Star Rail does with the Divergent Universe and forcing my characters to be in different builds sometimes. I would strongly prefer if it let me toggle that option off in that game mode. I would rather use my own characters, whether that is a good or a bad thing. These are games based on building up your accounts and building your characters. So of course I want to use my own. I don't care if it's worse in some cases. I would just always prefer to use my own, plain and simple. I just understand that it would be a very helpful thing for many players. So what about the big question? Is the Imaginarium Theater the end game that we were thinking we would never get? Because that interview made it sound very unlikely that they were ever going to develop more endgame, and that ultimately they were just content with renewing the Spiral Abyss for an eternity and leaving that as the premier endgame mode. I personally don't think there's any way around it. The Imaginarium Theater is an endgame mode. It is something to do alongside the Spiral Abyss. I don't think it's more difficult than the Spiral Abyss, but it 100% can be more difficult if your account is not well suited for the restrictions that this imposes on you. For some players, this will be an additional endgame mode that is more challenging than the Abyss, but I think for the majority of veteran players that this is going to be a relatively easy game mode that is just added into the regular routine that gives some rewards. The tricky thing is I don't think there was one solution that really would have appeased everybody, because there were different groups of people who had their own idea of what more endgame meant. Some just would have been okay with more floors on the Spiral Abyss that were of a higher difficulty. Others would have been okay if the Spiral Abyss was just reworked into being a more fun experience. I certainly consider myself a member of that camp. You know, if the Spiral Abyss blessings gave you things like increased attack speed, more cooldown reduction, more movement speed, just something more interesting than the tiny little buffs it gives, that experience would be a lot better because you would have unique experiences in there. In some cases, they might actually be so fun that you actually want to replay it, maybe with some new characters. As of right now, I am pretty content with the Imaginarium Theater. We have one cycle so far. That is not much to go off of. We've had abysses that were so easy, it was laughable. We've also had other abysses where even whales struggled to clear it with ease because the enemy layout was just an absolute nightmare designed in hell. The enemies in this version of the Imaginarium Theater are pretty damn reasonable, and I like that in the little fights you have the option to pick what you fight. So if you don't feel like dealing with a bunch of specters or something, you can pick the other things. It at least has some degree of control, and it is very different from the Spiral Abyss. I really love the game mode. I do. I had a lot of fun with it, and I can't wait to see it grow and, you know, be different each cycle. It's also just going to heavily depend on the elemental combinations. I don't know if they're ever going to, like, prevent this from happening, but if Geo and Animo ever get into the same cycle, that is going to be bad for basically the entire community. Almost nobody really cares about Geo, let alone actually rolls for their characters. I'm sure when and if that time comes, my C4 Ito will see a lot of use through the support system. Feel free to share your thoughts on this game mode in the comments below. If you want to write a 1,000-word hate essay on it, I encourage you to do so. Feed the hate into the YouTube algorithm. That is all I got for you today, so thank you to my members and patrons for supporting me. Thank you for watching this video, and I will see you in the next one.